The morning light of Zentari Prime cast long shadows across the crystal spires of the Galactic Academy. Jake Martinez adjusted his thick glasses and hurried down the gleaming corridors, his worn backpack bouncing against his shoulder. The halls buzzed with activity as students from dozens of different worlds made their way to classes. Jake still couldn't believe he was here, the first human exchange student ever accepted to the most prestigious educational institution in the galaxy. He paused at the entrance to Professor Vextara's classroom, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The room was unlike anything on Earth, with walls that seemed to shift between transparent and opaque depending on the angle of view. Strange plants from various worlds lined the edges, their leaves rustling without any apparent breeze. The desks were arranged in a circle, each one adjusted to accommodate the unique physiology of different species. Jake took his usual seat near the back, pulling out his notebook and pen. Around him, his classmates were settling in with their own strange collection of writing implements and recording devices. To his left sat Rex, a beaskin whose thick fur covered most of his body except for his face and hands. Rex's claws made soft clicking sounds as he organized his materials on the desk. His species came from a world where survival depended on physical strength and natural hunting abilities. Across the circle, Bloom swayed gently in her chair. The Verdani student looked more like a walking tree than what Jake would consider a person, with bark-like skin and leaves that changed color with her mood. Currently, they were a calm green, suggesting she was relaxed and ready for class. Her people were plant-based beings who could photosynthesize their own food and had an innate connection to all growing things. Near the front sat Splash, the hydroid representative. Her skin had a wet, glossy appearance that never seemed to dry, and she wore a special breathing apparatus that allowed her to survive in the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the academy. Her people had evolved entirely underwater on a world covered in vast oceans, where fire was not just unknown but physically impossible to create. Professor Vextara entered the room with her characteristic flowing movement. She was tall and elegant, her crystalline body catching and reflecting the light in mesmerizing patterns. Her species, the Quartz Collective, were living mineral beings who could reshape their forms at will. She had been teaching at the Galactic Academy for over 2 centuries, specializing in what she called primitive survival methods. "Students," Professor Vextara began, her voice carrying the musical quality that came from sound vibrating through crystal. "Today we discuss the most fundamental skill that separates advanced civilizations from basic existence." She gestured with one of her faceted hands, and the walls of the classroom became transparent, revealing a view of the Academy's vast gardens. "Fire creation and control?" Jake leaned forward, interested despite himself. On Earth, making fire was something he had only done a few times during camping trips with his family. It had always seemed like a complicated process involving lots of patience and the right materials. He adjusted his glasses and began taking notes. "Fire," the professor continued, "is the foundation upon which most technological advancement builds. It allows for metalworking, cooking, warmth, and protection. Without fire, most species remain trapped in their primitive state." She moved around the circle, her crystalline form shifting colors as she spoke. "However, not all species have the same relationship with fire. Some, like the beaskin, have used it for thousands of years. Others, like the hydroids, have never encountered it in their natural environment." Splash shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the water in her breathing apparatus bubbling slightly. Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her. He couldn't imagine how difficult it must be to learn about something so foreign to your entire way of life. "Your final examination for this course," Professor Vextara announced, causing several students to sit up straighter, "will be a practical demonstration of fire creation using only primitive materials. No modern technology, no species-specific advantages that cannot be replicated by others. You will have access only to what any stranded being might find on a basic habitable world." Rex's claws clicked against his desk as he considered this. His species had natural advantages when it came to creating wood shavings and friction, but the professor had just said they couldn't use species-specific advantages. Bloom's leaves rustled nervously, shifting to a worried yellow color. How could she create fire when her entire being was designed to avoid it? Jake pushed his glasses up his nose and continued writing. He had read about various fire-making techniques in his survival books back on Earth. There was the bow drill method, flint, and steel, fire pistons, and even using ice as a lens in certain conditions. It seemed like a challenging but manageable task. The examination will take place in our environmental simulation dome, Professor Vexthara explained, gesturing toward another section of the academy. You will each be provided with identical materials: dry grass for tinder, small twigs for kindling, larger branches for fuel, 2 pieces of flint and a steel striker. The goal is not speed, but competence. I expect this exercise to take several hours as you work through the traditional methods. Several students began asking questions about the specifics of the test. Could they work together? No, this was an individual assessment. Could they bring personal items? No, only the provided materials would be available. Could they practice beforehand? Yes, but only with the same basic materials that would be available during the exam. Jake found himself thinking about the challenge as the class continued. He had never been particularly skilled at outdoor activities. Back on Earth, he was much more comfortable in a library or laboratory than in the wilderness. His thick glasses were a constant reminder of how his eyes had never adapted well to focusing on distant objects, something that might have been useful for a hunter or gatherer in primitive times. The professor spent the rest of the class period explaining different fire-making techniques used across the galaxy. She showed them images of various species creating fire through friction, percussion, and even chemical methods. Each technique required patience, skill, and often significant physical effort. As the class ended, Jake packed his notebook and pen, his mind already working through the problem. He had 3 weeks to prepare for the exam, and he wanted to make sure he didn't embarrass himself or, worse, humanity's reputation at the academy. He was, after all, the first human student here, and his performance would influence how future human applicants were viewed. Walking back to his dormitory, Jake passed other students practicing various skills in the academy's outdoor areas. He could see Rex working with pieces of wood, his claws creating precise cuts and shavings. Bloom was experimenting with different types of dried plant material, her natural understanding of botanical properties giving her insights into what would burn best. That evening, Jake sat in his room reading everything he could find about fire creation. The Academy's library had information about techniques from hundreds of different worlds, but most required either natural abilities that humans didn't possess or tools that wouldn't be available during the exam. He was beginning to understand why Professor Vexthara expected the test to take several hours. As he prepared for bed, Jake cleaned his glasses with his shirt, a habit he had developed over years of wear. The thick lenses were essential for his vision, correcting the nearsightedness that had plagued him since childhood. Without them, the world became a blur of indistinct shapes and colors. He had never considered them as anything more than a medical necessity, a tool that allowed him to function normally in daily life. Tomorrow, he would begin practicing for the exam, learning to create fire the way countless generations had before. Modern technology made it unnecessary. He had no idea that the very glasses he wore to see clearly would soon change everything the galaxy understood about human ingenuity. 3 weeks had passed since Professor Vexthara announced the fire-making exam, and Jake had spent every available moment practicing with the basic materials. His hands were covered in small cuts and blisters from working with flint and steel, and his fingers ached from attempts at the bow drill method. Despite his efforts, he had only managed to create a few small sparks, nothing that could sustain an actual flame. The morning of the exam arrived with the usual bright light of Centauri Prime's twin suns. Jake gathered his belongings and made his way to the environmental simulation dome, a massive structure that could recreate the conditions of almost any habitable world in the galaxy. His stomach felt tight with nervousness as he joined his classmates outside the entrance. Rex stood nearby, flexing his claws and looking confident. Over the past weeks, the Beastkin had become quite skilled at creating wood shavings and had successfully made fire several times during practice sessions. His natural strength and sharp claws gave him significant advantages when working with wood and friction methods. Bloom swayed gently beside a cluster of other plant-based students from different classes who had come to watch. Her leaves had shifted to a determined orange color, and she had spent the preparation time studying which types of dried materials would ignite most easily. Her people's deep understanding of plant properties had served her well in selecting the best tinder and kindling. Splash looked the most nervous of all the students. Her breathing apparatus bubbled more rapidly than usual, and the water inside had a slightly cloudy appearance that Jake had learned indicated stress in hydroids. She had struggled throughout the preparation period since her species had no natural relationship with fire or the materials needed to create it. Professor Vexthara appeared at the dome's entrance, her crystalline form reflecting the morning light in brilliant patterns. "Students, please follow me into the examination environment," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered group. "You will each be assigned a designated area within the forest simulation. The test will begin when all participants are in position." They followed her through the dome's massive doors into what appeared to be a completely natural forest clearing. The artificial environment was so realistic that Jake could smell the earthy scent of soil and fallen leaves. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. The dome's technology was so advanced that it was impossible to tell they were inside a building. Jake was assigned to a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The ground was covered with a soft layer of fallen leaves, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above in shifting patterns. In the center of his area, he found a neat pile of materials exactly as Professor Vexthara had described: dry grass, bundled into small portions, thin twigs sorted by size, larger branches for fuel, 2 pieces of flint, and a steel striker. Looking around at his fellow students, Jake could see they had all received identical supplies. Each clearing was similar in size and layout, ensuring that no one had an advantage based on their environment. The artificial sun in the dome's ceiling provided steady, bright light that mimicked natural sunlight perfectly. "You have until midday to successfully create and maintain a fire," Professor Vexthara announced, her voice somehow carrying to all areas of the dome simultaneously. "You may begin when you hear the starting signal." A soft chime echoed through the forest, and immediately the students began working. Jake picked up the flint and steel, remembering the technique he had practiced countless times over the past weeks. He struck the steel against the flint, creating a small shower of sparks that fell toward the dry grass. Most of the sparks died immediately, but one landed on a particularly dry piece of grass and began to smolder. Jake quickly knelt down and blew gently on the smoldering spot, trying to coax it into a flame. The grass glowed brighter for a moment, then went dark. He tried again, striking the flint more aggressively and aiming the sparks more carefully. After several attempts, he managed to get another small ember, but it too died before he could turn it into actual fire. In the clearing next to him, Rex was already making progress. The Beastkin had used his claws to create a pile of fine wood shavings and was using the bow drill method with impressive skill. His natural strength allowed him to maintain steady pressure and speed, and Jake could see a thin wisp of smoke rising from Rex's efforts. Bloom had taken a different approach entirely. She had arranged her materials in a careful pattern and was using her natural understanding of plant chemistry to select the most flammable combinations. Her leaves had shifted to a focused blue color, and she worked with the methodical precision that came from generations of botanical knowledge. Splash was struggling significantly. Her lack of familiarity with fire-making materials was evident as she awkwardly handled the flint and steel. The breathing apparatus made it difficult for her to get close enough to the materials to work effectively, and her hands, adapted for swimming, were not well suited for the precise movements required. Jake continued his attempts with the flint and steel, but after an hour of effort, he had only managed to create sparks that quickly died. His hands were getting sore from the repetitive striking motion, and he was beginning to feel frustrated. He had read about the technique extensively and understood the theory, but putting it into practice was proving much more difficult than he had anticipated. The artificial sun climbed higher in the domed sky, and Jake realized he was running out of time. Around him, he could hear the occasional excited voices of other students who were making progress. Rex had achieved a small flame and was carefully feeding it with increasingly larger pieces of wood. Bloom had created a steady smolder in her tinder and was working to turn it into actual fire. Jake sat back on his heels and wiped sweat from his forehead. His glasses had slipped down his nose, and he pushed them back up with one finger. The thick lenses caught the sunlight for a moment, creating a small bright spot on the ground near his feet. He stared at the spot of light, his mind suddenly racing. He had been so focused on the traditional methods that he had completely overlooked other possibilities. Jake removed his glasses and held them up to examine the thick lenses more closely. They were designed to correct his nearsightedness, which meant they were convex lenses that could focus light into a concentrated beam, looking up at the artificial sun. Jake realized it was positioned at almost the perfect angle. The light was bright and steady, unlike the variable conditions he might encounter in a real outdoor situation. He gathered some of the driest grass and arranged it into a small, tight bundle. Then he held his glasses at arm's length, adjusting the distance until the sunlight focused into a tiny, intense point of light on the grass. The focused light was much more concentrated than any spark he had created with the flint and steel. Jake watched as the grass began to darken at the focal point, then started to produce a thin wisp of smoke. He moved the glasses slightly to maintain the focus, and within seconds, the grass burst into a small flame. Jake quickly set his glasses aside and gently blew on the flame, feeding it with additional dry grass and small twigs. The fire grew steadily, and soon he had a proper blaze going with the larger branches. The entire process had taken less than 2 minutes from start to finish. Professor Vexthara had been observing all the students from a central position, but Jake's sudden success caught her attention. Her crystalline form shifted colors rapidly, displaying the confusion and amazement that her species showed when encountering something unexpected. She began moving toward Jake's clearing, her movements faster than her usual graceful pace. The other students had also noticed Jake's fire. Rex paused in his own efforts, his mouth hanging open in surprise. Bloom's leaves rustled with agitation as she tried to understand what had happened. Even Splash stopped her struggling with the flint and steel to stare at the human who had somehow created fire faster than anyone else. Jake put his glasses back on and looked around at the surprised faces of his classmates and professor. He had successfully completed the exam, but he could see that his method had raised questions that went far beyond simple fire-making techniques. Professor Vexthara approached Jake's clearing with measured steps, her crystalline form shifting through different colors as she processed what she had witnessed. The other students had stopped their own work entirely, drawn by the impossible sight of the human creating fire in less time than it took most species to properly arrange their materials. "Student Martinez," the professor said, her voice carrying a tone Jake had never heard before. It was not the usual academic authority, but something closer to genuine curiosity mixed with disbelief. "Please explain your methodology." Jake looked down at his small but growing fire, then back at his professor. He had not expected his solution to cause such a reaction. On Earth, using a magnifying glass to start a fire was a common technique taught to children in basic survival courses. He had simply adapted the principle to use his prescription glasses instead of a traditional magnifying glass. "I use my glasses to focus the sunlight," Jake said simply, adjusting the frames on his nose. "The lenses are convex, which means they can concentrate light into a single point. When you focus sunlight into a small enough area, it creates enough heat to ignite dry material." Rex had abandoned his own fire-making attempts entirely and moved closer to Jake's clearing. His claws clicked against the ground as he crouched down to examine the setup. "But those are for seeing," Rex said, his voice full of confusion. "How can seeing tools make fire?" Jake picked up his glasses and held them so the other students could see. "These lenses correct my vision because they bend light in specific ways. The same property that helps me see clearly can also focus sunlight into a concentrated beam. It's basic physics about how light behaves when it passes through curved glass. Bloom swayed closer, her leaves rustling with interest. The color had shifted to a bright yellow that indicated intense curiosity in her species. Your species creates tools that serve multiple purposes? She asked. We have never encountered implements that function in such different ways. Not exactly, Jake replied, carefully tending his fire as he spoke. Glasses are designed specifically for vision correction. I just realized that their physical properties could be used for something else. It's called repurposing, taking an object designed for one function and using it for another. Professor Vexthara's crystalline form had settled into a deep blue, color that Jake had learned indicated deep thought in her species. She was processing implications that went far beyond a simple fire-making technique. In all my years of teaching this course, I have never observed a student approach the problem from this angle. Most species work within their natural capabilities, or use established techniques passed down through generations. Splash had given up entirely on her own attempts and was now standing at the edge of Jake's clearing, her breathing apparatus bubbling rapidly with excitement. Your people create fire using light tools? She asked, her voice muffled by the water-filled device. My people have light tools for deep ocean exploration, but we never considered using them for heat creation. Jake nodded and demonstrated the technique again, using his glasses to focus another beam of sunlight onto a fresh piece of grass. The material began smoking almost immediately, and within seconds, another small flame appeared. The key is having the right type of lens and strong enough light source. Your light tools might work if they use focused beams instead of scattered illumination. The professor moved even closer, her academic instincts fully engaged. Student: Martinez, you have introduced a concept that challenges fundamental assumptions about survival methodology. Most species approach fire-making as a test of their natural abilities or learned traditional skills. You have instead modified your environment to serve your needs. Other students from different classes had begun gathering outside Jake's clearing. Drawn by the unusual activity, word was spreading through the dome that something unprecedented was happening in Professor Vexthara's examination. Jake could see various alien species pressed against the invisible barriers that separated the test areas, their expressions ranging from confusion to amazement. This is not just about fire, Professor Vexthara continued, her voice growing more excited as she spoke. This represents a fundamentally different approach to problem solving. Where other species adapt to their environment, humans appear to adapt their environment to serve their purposes. Jake fed another small branch to his fire, which was now burning steadily and producing a good amount of heat. I guess we do think that way, he said thoughtfully. When we encounter a problem, we look for solutions using whatever tools are available. Sometimes that means using things in ways they weren't originally intended for. Rex was still crouched nearby, studying Jake's glasses with intense interest. But how did you know this would work? Did your teachers tell you about this technique? Not exactly, Jake replied. I learned about using magnifying glasses to start fires when I was young, but I had to figure out that my prescription glasses could work the same way. It's about understanding the basic principles and then applying them to new situations. Bloom had moved close enough that her leaves were almost touching Jake's fire. Your species teaches basic principles that can be applied in multiple ways, rather than specific techniques for specific situations? Both, actually, Jake said. We learn specific techniques, but we also learn the underlying science so we can understand why things work. That way, when we encounter new problems, we can use the same principles to find solutions. Professor Vexthara was now pacing around the clearing, her crystalline form cycling through different colors as she processed the implications of what she was witnessing. This changes everything, she said, more to herself than to the students. If humans can take any tool and repurpose it for survival needs, they possess an adaptability that we have not seen in any other species. The artificial sun had reached its midday position, indicating that the examination time was nearly over. Around the dome, most students were still working with their traditional methods, some having achieved small fires, others still struggling with the basic techniques. But Jake's fire had been burning steadily for over an hour, fed by the larger branches and producing enough heat to be clearly felt by everyone in the clearing. "Student Martinez," Professor Vexthara said formally, "you have successfully completed the examination in record time, using a methodology that demonstrates exceptional innovative thinking. However, I must ask, is this technique known to others of your species?" Jake nodded. "Using magnifying glasses to start fires is pretty common knowledge on Earth. Most children learn about it in school or scout programs. The specific technique of using prescription glasses might be less common, but the basic principle is well known." The professor's colors shifted to a deep purple that indicated profound realization. "You mean to tell me that your entire species is educated in principles that allow for this type of adaptive tool use?" "To some extent, yes," Jake replied. "We're taught to think creatively about problems and to look for solutions using available resources. It's considered a basic survival skill." Professor Vexthara looked around at the other students, who were all listening intently to this conversation. Rex had completely abandoned his fire-making attempts and was now examining every tool in his area with new eyes, wondering what other purposes they might serve. Bloom was touching various objects with her leaves as if trying to sense hidden potential functions. Even Splash was looking at her breathing apparatus with renewed interest. "Class is dismissed," Professor Vexthara announced suddenly. "All students have passed the examination regardless of their current progress. We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss new approaches to survival methodology." As the other students began gathering their materials, Jake carefully extinguished his fire and cleaned his glasses. He had no idea that his simple application of basic physics had just revolutionized survival education across the galaxy. In trying to complete a routine assignment, he had inadvertently demonstrated a fundamental aspect of human nature that would change how entire civilizations approached problem solving. The dome's artificial environment began to fade as the examination officially ended, but the impact of what had happened would resonate through the Galactic Academy for years to come. Jake had shown that humans did not just survive, they innovated, adapted, and found solutions that others had never imagined possible. The faculty meeting room at the Galactic Academy had never seen such urgent activity. Professor Vexthara had called an emergency session immediately after Jake's demonstration, and now 12 of the most distinguished educators from across the galaxy sat around the crystalline conference table. The room buzzed with translated conversations as beings from different worlds tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Professor Vexthara stood at the head of the table, her form cycling through colors more rapidly than usual, indicating the high level of excitement and confusion she was experiencing. "Colleagues," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's translation systems, "what I observed today challenges every assumption we have made about survival methodology and species adaptation." Dr. Krill, the insectoid head of the engineering department, clicked his mandibles together in the pattern that indicated skepticism. "Vexthara, you called this meeting because a student used a light-focusing device to create fire. While creative, this seems like a relatively minor technical achievement." "You misunderstand the significance," Professor Vexthara replied, her form shifting to a bright red that indicated passionate conviction. "This human did not simply use a tool designed for fire-making. He repurposed a medical device created for an entirely different function and adapted it to solve a survival problem. This represents a form of thinking we have never encountered." Dean Flora, whose plant-like form was similar to Bloom's but much larger and more ancient, rustled her leaves thoughtfully. "In my 3 centuries of education, I've observed countless species approach problems within their natural capabilities. The beastkin use their claws, the hydroids adapt to aquatic environments, the quartz collective reshaped their forms. But this human used something completely unrelated to fire-making." The room fell silent as the implications began to sink in. Professor Zephyr, whose gaseous form floated near the ceiling, spoke in the whistling tone of his people. Are you suggesting that humans do not think in terms of specialized tools and specific applications? Exactly, Professor Vexthara confirmed. When I questioned student Martinez about his methodology, he explained that his species is taught to understand underlying principles rather than just memorize specific techniques. This allows them to apply the same knowledge to completely different situations. Dr. Krill's compound eyes focused intently on the professor. Provide specific examples of this principle-based thinking. Professor Vexthara activated the room's holographic display system, showing a recording of Jake's demonstration. Observe his approach carefully. While other students worked with the provided materials using traditional methods, the human analyzed the available resources differently. He identified that his corrective lenses could focus light, that the artificial sun provided sufficient energy, and that concentrated light could generate the heat needed for ignition. The hologram showed Jake removing his glasses and positioning them to focus the sunlight. The other faculty members watched in fascination as the human created fire in seconds while his classmates struggled with conventional techniques. This is not simply tool use, Professor Vexthara continued. This is tool adaptation? The human took an object designed for one purpose and reimagined its function entirely. When I asked him about this, he seemed surprised that other species do not regularly engage in this type of thinking. Dean Flora's leaves had shifted to a deep purple color that indicated profound thought. If this is representative of human cognitive patterns, it suggests a level of adaptability that could revolutionize how we approach education and problem-solving across all fields. The room erupted in discussion as faculty members from different departments began to grasp the broader implications. Professor Mindak, whose telepathic species had developed advanced mental techniques, projected his thoughts directly into the translation system. In my studies of consciousness across species, I have observed that most beings think in terms of established patterns and learned behaviors. This human appears to think in terms of flexible principles that can be applied to novel situations. Doctor? Krill stood and began pacing, his 6 legs clicking against the floor in a rhythm that indicated intense concentration. If humans can repurpose any tool for survival applications, they possess an adaptive advantage that goes beyond physical capabilities or natural talents. They can potentially survive in environments where other species would fail, not because they are stronger or more resilient, but because they can innovate solutions using available resources. Professor Vexthara nodded enthusiastically. Student Martinez mentioned that this type of creative problem-solving is considered basic education. On Earth, he indicated that human children are taught to think this way from an early age. If this is true, we may be looking at an entire civilization built on adaptive innovation. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Academy had always based its curriculum on the assumption that different species had different natural strengths and limitations. The Beastkin were taught to use their physical advantages, the Verdani learned to work with biological systems, the Hydroids focused on aquatic applications. But humans appear to transcend these limitations through creative thinking. We must restructure our entire approach to survival education, Dean Flora declared, her leaves rustling with excitement. If humans can teach other species to think in terms of adaptive tool use, we could revolutionize survival capabilities across the galaxy. Professor Zephyr drifted lower in the room, his gaseous form condensing slightly as he spoke. But can other species learn to think this way? Human neural patterns may be uniquely suited to this type of flexible reasoning. There is only one way to find out, Professor Vexthara replied. We must invite student Martinez to demonstrate his methodology to other faculty members and advanced students. If human thinking patterns can be taught, we have an opportunity to transform education throughout the galaxy. Dr. Krill's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed the possibilities. If this human can teach adaptive thinking, he becomes more than just a student. He becomes a potential instructor in cognitive methodology that could benefit every species in the Academy. The meeting continued for hours as faculty members debated the implications and developed plans for further Investigation. They discussed restructuring courses, inviting human educators to the academy, and even establishing an exchange program to send alien students to Earth to study human problem-solving methods. As the meeting concluded, Professor Vextara felt a sense of excitement she had not experienced in decades of teaching. She had witnessed something that would fundamentally change how the galaxy approached education and survival. The human student who had simply wanted to pass a fire-making exam had inadvertently demonstrated that his species possessed a form of intelligence that could benefit all civilizations. The next morning, Jake received an unexpected message requesting his presence in the dean's office. As he walked through the academy's corridors, he noticed other students looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Word of his demonstration had spread throughout the student body, and many were eager to understand how he had solved the fire-making challenge so quickly. Jake had no idea that his simple use of his glasses had triggered a complete reevaluation of survival education at the galaxy's most prestigious institution. He was about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest solutions, and that human ingenuity was about to become the subject of intense academic study across dozens of worlds. When he reached the dean's office, he found not only Dean Flora waiting for him, but also Professor Vextara and several other faculty members he recognized from around the academy. Their expressions suggested that this meeting would be far more significant than a simple follow-up to his examination performance. "Student Martinez," Dean Flora began, her leaves shifting to a warm golden color that indicated welcome and respect. "We have a proposition that could change the future of education throughout the galaxy." Jake sat in the dean's office, surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy, feeling completely overwhelmed by the attention his simple fire-making technique had generated. Dean Flora's leaves rustled gently as she explained the Academy's proposal, while Professor Vexthara's crystalline form glowed with excitement. "Student Martinez," Dean Flora began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of academic authority, "your demonstration yesterday has revealed something extraordinary about human cognitive patterns. We would like to offer you a full scholarship to continue your studies here, with the additional opportunity to develop a new curriculum focused on adaptive problem-solving techniques." Jake pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit that had become even more pronounced since his glasses had become the center of galactic academic attention. "I don't understand why everyone is so excited about this. Using a magnifying glass to start a fire is something most humans learn as children. It's really not that special." Professor Vexthara leaned forward, her form shifting to a warm blue color that indicated patient explanation. "That is precisely what makes it remarkable, Student Martinez. What you consider basic childhood education represents a form of thinking that we have never encountered in any other species. The ability to repurpose tools and apply principles across different situations appears to be uniquely human." Over the following weeks, Jake found himself at the center of an academic revolution. The news of his demonstration had spread beyond the Galactic Academy, reaching universities and research institutions across dozens of worlds. Representatives from various species requested demonstrations of human problem-solving techniques, and Jake was asked to present his methodology to increasingly large audiences. The first major presentation took place in the Academy's Grand Amphitheater, with over 3,000 students and faculty members from across the galaxy in attendance. Jake stood on the stage, feeling small beneath the massive domed ceiling that displayed real-time images of distant stars and nebulae. In the audience, he could see beings from every corner of known space, all eager to understand how humans approached problem-solving. "The key to human thinking," Jake explained, holding up his glasses for the audience to see, "is that we learn principles instead of just specific techniques. When I needed to make fire, I didn't just think about traditional methods. I thought about the physics of heat generation and looked for any available tools that could help me apply those principles." Rex sat in the front row, his claws clicking excitedly against his seat. Over the past month, he had been working with Jake to understand adaptive thinking, and he had already begun applying the concepts to his own studies. Student Martinez helped me realize that my claws are not just for hunting or fire making, Rex announced to the audience. They can be used for precise measurements, for creating musical instruments, for carving communication symbols. I had never considered my natural tools in such flexible ways. Bloom swayed beside him, her leaves a vibrant green that indicated joy and discovery. Human thinking has taught me that my photosynthetic abilities can be used for more than just feeding myself. I can create chemical reactions for various purposes, generate different types of light, even produce specific scents for communication. The principles of biochemistry apply to many more situations than I had ever imagined. Jake continued his presentation, demonstrating various examples of adaptive tool use and principle-based thinking. He showed how a simple pen could be used as a measuring device, a lever, a tube for focused airflow, or even a small telescope when combined with other materials. Each demonstration caused murmurs of amazement from the audience as they began to understand the flexibility of human problem-solving. Professor Vexthara took the stage to announce the Academy's new curriculum changes. Beginning next semester, we will be implementing courses in adaptive problem-solving and cross-application thinking, taught by Student Martinez and a team of human educators who will be joining our faculty. These courses will be available to students from all species and will focus on developing flexible thinking patterns. The response was overwhelming. Applications for the new courses filled up within hours, and requests came from other academic institutions across the galaxy asking for similar programs. Jake found himself appointed as the Academy's first Human Innovation Specialist, a position that had been created specifically to study and teach human cognitive approaches. Months later, Jake stood in a classroom filled with students from over 20 different species, all eager to learn adaptive thinking techniques. Splash had become one of his most dedicated students, discovering that her aquatic background gave her unique insights into fluid dynamics that could be applied to various engineering problems. Her breathing apparatus, once seen as a limitation in terrestrial environments, became a tool for studying pressure differentials and gas exchange systems. Today we're going to practice repurposing common objects, Jake announced to his class. Everyone choose something you use regularly and think about 3 completely different ways it could be applied to solve problems. The classroom buzzed with activity as students examined their belongings with new perspectives. A crystalline student discovered that her natural light refracting abilities could be used for precision optics work. A gaseous student realized his form-changing capabilities had applications in chemical mixing and atmospheric analysis. A plant-based student found that her root systems could be adapted for complex computational networks. Jake walked among his students, offering guidance and encouragement as they explored new ways of thinking. He had never imagined that his simple use of glasses to start a fire would lead to such dramatic changes in galactic education. The concept of adaptive thinking was spreading to other fields as well, with engineering departments reporting breakthrough innovations and research teams discovering new applications for existing technologies. The most significant change came when other species began developing their own versions of adaptive thinking based on their unique characteristics. The Beastkin created new forms of precision crafting, the Verdani developed biological computing systems, and the Hydroids pioneered pressure-based manufacturing techniques. Each species was discovering that their natural abilities could be applied in ways they had never considered. As Jake's first year as an instructor concluded, he received news that would change his life once again. Earth's government had received requests from over 50 different worlds asking to establish educational exchange programs focused on human problem-solving techniques. Jake was offered the opportunity to return to Earth as an ambassador for adaptive thinking, helping to develop programs that would bring human educators to alien worlds and alien students to Earth. On his final day at the Galactic Academy, Jake stood once again in the environmental dome where his journey had begun. The same artificial forest surrounded him, but now it was filled with students from dozens of species, all practicing the fire-making techniques he had demonstrated. Some used traditional methods, others applied adaptive approaches, and a few had developed entirely new techniques based on principles Jake had taught them. Rex approached him, carrying a carefully crafted wooden sculpture that depicted the moment Jake had used his glasses to create fire. "This is for you," Rex said, his claws having created incredibly detailed work that captured not just the physical action, but somehow conveyed the moment of innovation that had changed everything. Bloom presented him with a living plant that she had genetically modified to produce flowers in the exact colors of Jake's glasses frames. "This will remind you that growth comes from seeing things in new ways," she said, her leaves rustling with affection. Even Splash had created a gift, a complex water sculpture that demonstrated fluid dynamics principles in a way that could only be appreciated by someone who understood both artistic beauty and scientific accuracy. Professor Vexthara's farewell was the most meaningful of all. "Student Martinez, you came here to learn about survival techniques, but you have taught us something far more valuable. You have shown us that the greatest survival tool any species can possess is the ability to think beyond established patterns and find new solutions to old problems." As Jake prepared to leave the academy, he reflected on how much had changed since that first day in Professor Vexthara's classroom. He had arrived as a nervous human student hoping to pass a simple exam, and he was leaving as a teacher whose ideas would influence education across the galaxy for generations to come. The glasses that had started it all still sat on his nose, still helping him see clearly, but now they also served as a symbol of human ingenuity that had opened the galaxy's eyes to new possibilities. Jake Martinez had proven that sometimes the most powerful innovations come not from advanced technology or natural advantages, but from the simple willingness to look at familiar things in completely new ways.